For those that can hear me, time waits for no one. This next man understands why, how people must take a stand and join hands and come together in times of civil unrestlessness. As a music percussionist, his music was the pulse of the street. 3,000 commercial recordings is where you'll find his beat. As a composer, his music will be heard for the next 100 years. As a music activist, you can hear the joy and pain of blood, sweat, and tears from the past and future generations, and his message is wake up. There was time when it was unspoken word that civil aggression should have never been endured by so many. To take the hand of the next man, swing him around so the whole world can hear a new sound, committed to the pulse of the civil message, continuing the beat of the street. On this episode of Music Ecology, ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you African percussionist, master drummer, and composer, my college professor, Mr. Warren Smith.
Started in 1958. 1958 was my first teaching job at Wayland Junior High School in the Bronx. And then I went into Manhattan and into Brooklyn. I wound up teaching in a what they call the 600 school, which in those days was the place where they would dump the children who had been expelled from the normal school system into a group of teachers who were able to handle those kids, you know, and the kids were not bad kids, and they certainly were not unintelligent, you know, but they got labeled that way because they were in an alternative situation. But I found that to be very enjoyable because these kids who supposedly had problems turned out to be kids who were actually thinking for themselves and were able to disagree with their teachers and get thrown out of school primarily for that reason.
Before we get into our interview with African percussionist, master drummer, and composer, Mr. Warren Smith, we want to say that any lessons taught in this episode of Music Ecology can be found underneath our rhythms chart and rhythm studies. If you have any questions, feel free to log on to musicecology.com. Ladies and gentlemen, on this episode of Music Ecology, we're proud to bring to you African percussionist and composer and master drummer, Mr. Warren Smith. Welcome, Warren. Do you teach jazz at Lincoln Center?
You know, I still teach at Jazz at Lincoln Center in their intermediate school Jazz Academy. I teach improvised, free improvisation in their jazz music program. And I've done a lot of substitute teaching at the New School for Social Research in their jazz music program. So that's kept me busy, and I still take a few private students.
How long have you been playing?
I started playing the drums when I was 6 years old. Started on the saxophone when I was 3, because my father was a saxophone player. And I got too smart for him, I thought, when I was 6, so I decided I wanted to play the drums. And been with it ever since.
Tell me a little bit about the music scene in Chicago.
Well, it's pretty varied, actually. They had, of course, I was right in the center bed of the Mississippi blues, you know, Mississippi Delta, because there was a direct line right up to Chicago from Mississippi. People like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, different people like that were right around in the neighborhood. But the music that I really grew up on was swing band music. That's what my father was involved in, and all my uncles and some of my aunts. My mother played the harp, and I actually had 3 aunts who had a master's degree in piano, played piano and organ. And 1 aunt who was a tap dancer. You know, they were all involved in the arts one way or another, primarily in music and performance.
So how was it to work with Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell?
That was fantastic. I've forgotten who did the arrangements and how that came about, but you know, in those days you'd walk into a studio, you may or may not know who the artist was, which we didn't when we walked in there. And then you see this person, you know. And I didn't really know who Tammy Terrell was exactly, you know, but she was a great singer, and she was like kind of equal in strength and presence to Marvin Gaye, and what they were doing just blended so beautifully. I don't even remember which album it was, or which, in fact, maybe they only did 1 album together, because she passed away very shortly after that. But I also remember, I think it was the Coca-Cola commercial that I did with the 2 of them, which was also the same kind of quality, you know, except that it was much shorter. You know, it condenses itself down into like 30 seconds or 1 minute. But, you know, just seeing Marvin Gaye with that fantastic voice and the way he would produce those sounds.
Who was your favorite person to perform with?
Max Roach, in terms of jazz percussion especially. I had a great percussion teacher at the University of Illinois when I went there, named Paul William Price, and he inspired me to pursue a career in classical percussion. And I did pretty well in that, and I'm still involved in it to a certain extent. You know, I went to Tanglewood, the music camp of Boston Symphony Orchestra in the 50s, and while I was up there, I ran into Max Roach again, because they had a jazz center up there in Lenox, Massachusetts, which was right next door to Tanglewood. And Max came up to perform, and I ran into him at a bar. And we talked for a long time, and he suggested that I come to New York, and then I did get in touch with him, so I followed his advice and wound up being a lifelong friend, I would say, and an associate musically also.